And that sound marks the beginning of another Missal for the Masses. This is the Chaplain's Assistance Motorpod, and I am your host, Gary. And this is the podcast where I talk about what's going on in my life of collecting, and also make sure every episode I talk about a toy, playset, or vehicle from the G.I. Joe, a real American hero toy line from 1982 to modern day or present. So to begin the episode, just want to say thanks to all those who reached out about my quality issue on the last Missal with Stephen Jubber about the HasLab Sky Striker. Yes, I know my StreamYard skills are bad, but I figured out what's going on. It's my laptop's unfortunate lack of resources able to stream and capture audio at the same time. So I have to now, with tax return season on the way, I have to start budgeting out for a new laptop. So that's why when I do these solo shows, I sound great. But when I have to remote in for StreamYard or something else, it comes out all robotic-y. So one of the things that going on in my world of collecting is not buying stuff so I can afford a new laptop. You know, life happens. I use the laptop for a lot of things, like doing my taxes. So it's about time. It's 7 years old, so I guess it's had a good, productive life, and it's how I make this podcast. So I probably should do something about it. And speaking of which, I realized it was finally the laptop, and it was lack of resources, because I did a guest spot on the Long Box Crusade G.I. Joe Chronicles. It's coming out in probably another 2 months from this recording, so I'm thinking sometime May or June. And I did the recording with this microphone on my wife's iPad. The iPad worked fine. It's not really conducive for what I usually do, so.
Now back to G.I. Joe.
In the world of collecting, not much is going on. I've bought a couple things. They're in transit. I do not want to spoil the surprise of them. I will say that one of the things was an okay deal, supporting a friend. And then the other thing is a screaming deal. And like I said, I got tracking numbers on all this stuff, but it hasn't arrived. And, not spending a lot of money for, again, obvious reasons. And then what else is going on? Well, I had a contractor come inside the house and had to put everything into storage while he worked upstairs because, don't want paint on action figures. And now I'm slowly bringing everything out and going through it again and rearranging displays. So it's taking a little longer than I'd like, but that's the collecting life. So the inspiration for this Missal came from a trip I took to Atlanta, Georgia for my employer, going to the HAI helicopter show. I brought with me the paragon of unrepentant capitalism, Destro, and I was wondering, what am I going to get inspiration from here at the show? And, walking around the show, a lot of commercial helicopters of small and larger degree. It was an absolutely huge hall. And there was some military helicopters there. There were particularly fond of the Huey, the Bell Huey, and the Bell Cobra attack copter. And it's kind of hard to keep saying the Cobra attack copter because know it as the Dragonfly. And, you think about in 1983, your main bad guys are Cobra, and then you have a Cobra helicopter. Could get kind of confusing. I'm thinking helicopter, what haven't I covered? And there's a lot of helicopters in the line. And I know I've already talked about the 1990 Locust, not to be confused with the 2000-2001 Locust, which is essentially a Dragonfly, which is also a Cobra. I also did the Sky Storm. And I'm looking through my options. I'm like, do I do Destro's the spoiler? Destro did come on the trip with me. And I'm like, it was pretty tough. And then, the Fang. But the Fang really isn't a helicopter. It's a gyrocopter. And I have my own sorts of issues with that. But then I landed, as I was looking up some inspiration. And I realized I haven't covered anything from the Dreadnoks, so I'm looking through their repertoire of vehicles. I'm not covering the Dreadnok Air Assault set, but something from 1986, the Dreadnok Swampfire. Start with looking at the box and looking at how it's being, marketed. It stands out as a helicopter swamp vehicle because, swamp fire. And it's basically showing it scooting around on the water. So it's not really a helicopter so much on the box art, but you got Monkey Wrench sitting in the cockpit and, it's firing off and you got that digital blast effect. No, it doesn't really sell the Swampfire too much to me. I think the better marketing tool for this toy was always in the G.I. Joe Sunbow animation series. I do appreciate that we do still have some parts change color when exposed to sunlight, carrying over that gimmick all the way from 1984's Zartan. And it's just a neat little compact toy worth 2 flag points. So this was a good, cheap little vehicle for putting your figure in. And going to the back of the box, I like the marketing blurb. In boat mode, it blends with its environment, but when detected, the Swampfire opens its razor rotor for quick air escapes. It's based on Cobra Command's top secret designs, and it includes some of the most sophisticated technology in Cobra's weapons arsenal. And the big takeaway from this is the folding propeller blades, which I'm really going to say is a much needed feature of all G.I. Joe helicopters, just from a storage standpoint. And I am looking at you, G.I. Joe Tomahawk from 1986. So essentially the 2 gimmicks on the Swampfire are the fact that it changes from a boat to a helicopter and back again, and then you got the color changing feature. It is an open air cockpit because it is an action figure toy. And also, if to build an enclosed cockpit for this would really take away from the Dreadnok resourcefulness or recycling. I mean, hey, the Dreadnoks were green before green was green, and this thing is painted green. So the color changing plastic is the main rotor, the tail rotor, the 25 millimeter gun in the front, and the pontoons. The top half of the Swampfire otherwise is molded in a darker green, non-color changing plastic, and the tail rotor sits in a black fin, which clips in through the top and the bottom with horizontal stabilizers on the top and the bottom. And then on the bottom is a black hull for it to float on. I like the main design sticker where it has a pirate sword on the bottom of the hull underneath where the character sits or the pilot sits. It's a nice little feature, making this biker gang a little more piratey and a little more swashbucklerish, and it lends like a little aura about them. It makes them more Jack Sparrow than Toe Cutter. It's interesting. It changes the flavor of the Dreadnoks. It changes their role as much as anarchists or, a biker gang. And that's always been something that I've wrestled with, where Cobra is a clearly established terrorist organization and they're working with a biker gang. And what usually are the motivations of a biker gang? They're more like a little low level, mafia type thing where, drugs and violence and, maybe even to a small degree human trafficking. But I don't think in terms of my own headcanon that this biker gang is as insidious as Cobra, the terrorist organization. And then the other fact is you have this biker gang, generally used for comic relief in Sunbow, which is how my formulative G.I. Joe years, where they're bumbling, they're, these bad Benny Hill guys. Well, I can trust them with a motocross bike, motorcycle, or the Thunder Machine. So, very ground based. And then now you're giving them a helicopter. So where do these guys get the training to fly a helicopter? Helicopters are notoriously more complex for the pilot. And now, do these biker gang members have, military experience? And, how do I headcanon this away? Boats? Yeah, easy. It's, Zartan in the swamp with the swamp skier. You got Zanzibar with the air skiff. And even the air skiff's a little bit of a stretch, but that's another topic for another day. But you have this helicopter, this little one-man helicopter. How does this fit in? It's definitely, like they said, it's from Cobra High Command. You have a Cobra logo on either side of the Swampfire behind the seat. And, Cobra just hands out equipment to anybody that has 5 minutes of training, it seems. Here's the manual. We'll give you a walk around. Here, take your money, and then, slap you on the butt, and you're on your way. So it's just a neat little vehicle that fills a niche that I didn't know was there. So it's kind of hard to say this is an amphibious vehicle because it's, air and water, not for land. It is a dual purpose, kind of like the G.I. Joe Shark from 1984. That was air and water as well. Now, would this go up against the G.I. Joe Shark? I don't know. I think it'd be interesting, but I think the Shark has a couple other things going for it. But, looking through a kid's eyes, this is just a fun toy. And that's where I'm going to concentrate the rest of where I'm going to take this. Because trying to rationalize this as an adult is sometimes difficult. Now, taking a look at the blueprints here, it starts off with the breather's air induction engine cover. So what we have is on each side by the pilot's head. So monkey wrench with no hearing protection is, part of my mantra, Cobra, where safety is not first. And because you need to hear what? The good thing is, by having a twin inlets, it means that the low pressure area in front of him will not suck his head in to either one of them unless he, moves his head, but it will create a balance force which keeps his head in between. So there you go. I guess that's something to look forward. Unlike some of the other helicopters here, these don't snap off to reveal engine parts underneath, but they can snap off as long as the plastic isn't too brittle. Number 2 brings us to the very front of the gun. It is the Sinker 25mm auto-load repeating cannon. And as a kid, I didn't have this toy as a kid, but because of the Sunbow cartoon, I always thought it was a laser cannon rather than anything traditional ballistic. And, with that green color changing plastic, it is molded futuristically. It does have a nice little tri-fin design where it looks like a cross but no bottom fin. And the top fin is a little elongated compared to the 2 side fins to provide like an iron sight. Now, the back of the cannon also has a little bump up for like a rear sight. So you essentially have some iron sights that can be maneuvered by the character. There's no handle for him. The only reason why I'm not a huge fan of this being a ballistic is, the adult in me doesn't see where the auto-loading feature would be for the shells. I don't know how it is supposed to be manned by the pilot, if he's supposed to just use his left hand while his right hand's on the joystick to, manually turn it about, or if it's something where, like a modern Apache where, you wear the helmet and your sight picture is on your heads-up display on your helmet, and then when you turn your head, that's where the cannon is going to turn to. But, this is a Dreadnok vehicle, so I don't think they're handing out equipment like that. Then we go to the Swamp Tooth reinforced carbon mesh hull. That's basically, that's the boat portion of the Swampfire. That nice little black plastic that has some nice ridged detail. It probably works a little bit to keep it straight in the water, but it is more like a flatboat, so there's no keel. If anything, the keel would be in the back, in the rudder portion of the Swampfire. So when it's speeding through the marsh, like it shows in the box top picture, that's sunk down into the water as the boat tilts upwards. And with the fact that this 25 millimeter sinker gun only turns left and right, it doesn't elevate up or down, I think that turns the gun into an anti-air gun in boat mode versus, shooting at things straight in front of it, because it's not going to be there. It's not going to be able to aim down. So one of the other features of this is number 4 on the blueprints is the flared front stabilizing fins. So this would be similar to like a jet, where near the tail fin you have the stabilizers in the back, but here they're in the front, and it gives it almost like a hammerhead shark profile. It is interesting that these stabilizers are in the front. Now, helicopters generally don't really need them, but I guess when this thing's speeding through the swamps of the Everglades or the New Jersey marshlands, might be handy. And it gives it an aggressive profile, if anything else. And then the blueprints point out the number 5, the plank pilot command seat. So, all right, plank makes me think of, the pirates. We have that swashbuckling theme with that sticker on. So you're telling me that you build this boat helicopter thing and you put wood for the seats? It's probably not going to be too cushiony. So you should probably head down to your local TJ Maxx or department store and just get some cushions for that guy, or else you're going to get splinters on your behind. But then we get to one of my more favorite details of the Swampfire. You get the razor blade retractable boron fiber rotors. This is one of my favorite design elements because it's razor rotor for quick air escapes. So you're in the middle of the swamps and this thing pops open. So this rotor is a nice piece of engineering where, you pull them out a little bit and you could turn them 90 degrees. This is one area where it does tend to break because the plastic does get brittle through age. So it's razor tipped and it could cut through like brush and stuff. So this way, when it pops out in the middle of the swamp, we are able to cut through the jungle foliage and escape into the air. So that's a nice little dual feature, because usually helicopter rotors are notoriously fragile. So having a cutting blade type thing on the tips really, really helps things. And it also allows, the suspension of disbelief that the absolute torque of that motor isn't going to shear those blades in half when it comes across a 4-inch piece of swamp wood. It's a good piece of kit for the helicopter, and it spins pretty good. The pin inside, it's that when it plugs into the hull, it's loose, has good action, and if you ever want to take one of these apart, as I had to, you're probably better off, I ended up cutting the hull very carefully so I could salvage the main rotor piece for Steve from G.I. Joe. He asked me if I had that piece, and of course I did, on a broken Swampfire, and had to cut it apart in order to get it out in one piece. So while the blades can usually come off if they can unclip, the main rotor won't. So if you're ever trying to fix one of these, something to consider. It might sometimes be easier for that one piece if you're not willing to sacrifice a toy. Then you could be able to probably just buy a whole new shell for that piece. Next on the blueprints, we're getting to one of the other features that moves on the Swampfire, and that is the hydraulic operated gas dampened pontoon arms. And those are connected to the aluminum super sealed gas-filled pontoons. What that's telling me is that the pontoons, with their 1-foot peg each in the front, they're filled with gas to make them lighter. So we're thinking something like a helium or something lighter than air. But knowing Cobra or the Dreadnoks, they probably had a stash of hydrogen. So it's probably not too safe. And then again, we're also talking about the Dreadnoks. So if Zartan tells Torch, hey, fill it with gas, well, maybe Torch is not the right example, but if he tells Thrasher to fill the pontoons with gas, they'll just like, oh, okay, and they'll just put some 87 octane in there. If I was G.I. Joe, I'd aim for the pontoons. It could only be a great way to sink the Dreadnok forces. And again, with the color-changing plastic, it folds up nice and tight to the sides of the Swampfire when it comes down to provide that extra flotation or roll resistance to the Swampfire. These are very useful. I like them. I generally leave them down for the most part. I'm not always bringing them up. It looks right when it's down. But with it up, it looks different. But like as a boat, it looks more like a boat with it up. So they're almost like landing pontoons from helicopter mode. Because if I was in the swamp, I'd whip these up for less drag in the water and use that turbine engine to propel me forward with minimal drag. So should be able to get higher speeds and better gas mileage. So things to think about when you have a gas station in the New Jersey marshlands. Now, the next thing on the blueprint is number 9, the junked floor top-mounted personnel platform. So again, with the green recycling theme that the Dreadnoks love, making use of other, what some people's trash is other people's treasure. And on the blueprint, you have this little area, and it's graded and stuff. And it's like this material, and it looks kind of like, wooden planks all across the top. And this theme runs from stem to stern. It looks like the top of a boat, like a pirate ship. What's interesting is they're calling this the top-mounted personnel platforms, but there's really not much room for a Dreadnok or Cobra or anybody to really stand on over there. And then on top of that, where they're calling this a platform, there's no foot pegs. So from a play perspective, I wouldn't be using these. Where we're at, we're by the tail rotor and, this personnel platform. And you do have right in front of it, you have these stickers that on mine are actually on the wrong side and 90 degrees off. But, these are like gauges and stuff. Like this is where you're performing maintenance on the Swampfire. And it's like a neat little area, but it's kind of plain. If I was doing these blueprints, I would have pointed out the stickers and say, oh, this is the gauge that, reads off the fuel pressure, or, this is, your, part of your pre-flight check, come up with some things like that. But I wouldn't point out an area of the toy where I don't see a lot of play value. The next thing on the blueprints is the titanium finned directional rotor. That's the tail rotor. So like the 1990 Locust that I covered before, this does have a little spindle for your fingers to spin the tail rotors with on the right side. And it's nice. It just plugs in simply on the left side, and it's a good little color changing little tail rotor, and I like it. The tail rotor plastic, the housing, does have a neat little detail on the left side to simulate that it's a cover and it's covering the drive shaft to the tail rotor. While this is a value vehicle, I'm getting the feel of that model kit aesthetic where this is a fully realized helicopter in the designer's mind before it becomes a toy. Is it a simpler toy? Yes. But there's enough detail to make this believable while not being so simple or overly complex like I feel the 1982 Jump is. Now, to the full back of the helicopter is the horizontal aero hydro stabilizing rudders. I like the fact that they combined it together on the blueprint, and they've also combined it in the mold. This part is well thought out. You have the rudders connected, and you have little molded in hinges. So it looks exactly like what it would do. Now, this would be one thing realistically. It's kind of close to the main body of the Swampfire. So in the air, it might not be so effective. You might be relying more on your tail rotor for turning. It's nice that in the water, when, like I said, this thing's going to be tilted up, the actual hinge for the water rudder on the bottom is in that same plane. So when this tipped up, the rudder will be more vertical rather than the way it is. So when it's sitting flat on the ground, it's like tilted back. But the reason for that is for when in motion in the water, it's tilted up like a jet ski. Neat little feature there. And it's, again, one of those things it has just the right amount of detail for me with the two hinges. They look almost like door hinges. It's not going to be that bulky on a real boat or airplane, but it still continues a little bit of a recycled theme that the Dreadnoks would use with their vehicles. And then finally is the omnidirectional control stick, which is to the pilot's right. It's right next to the 25 millimeter gun, and it's part of the top half plastic. So it's in that non-color changing green. It's to the right. So typically helicopters have a very complex control. You have foot pedals, you have your joystick, which usually is two-handed and in the center. But again, if you're going to be using your left hand to turn your 25 millimeter cannon left to right, you're going to want your right hand to be on the joystick at the time. But it also works because, this is a kind of a cramped toy. So overall, it's not ideal, but for what we're trying to do as a toy, it works. And speaking of which, I've talked a lot about the design and stuff. This Swampfire was designed by Guy Cassidy. This is documented on Creating G.I. Joe, volume number 7, and also on 3D Joe's website as well with commentary. One of the things that's pointed out in both sources is the fact that the plastic smelled like toxic waste when they were sonic welding the pontoons together. And they had to put vanilla extract into it. So that's a neat little thing. Personally, I think it would have been a little bit more like Stinkor if you left it like that, and it would have fit in with the Dreadnok theme, because I don't think the Dreadnoks shower. It goes in both sources have a great working this from concept to toy, both as it, from how he molded them or sculpted it to the final realization. So it's definitely something you should check out. 3D Joe's is on YouTube. The link will be in the description below. And then also you can Dan Klingensmith's Creating G.I. Joe books, or 3 3/4 Joe as some of the earlier volumes were known. I'll put the link to the publishing below. I also know that, throwing this in there, it was just announced volume 11 is coming, and he released the table of contents for that, or potential table of contents for that. So I am really looking forward to backing that when the Kickstarter comes out. But off on that tangent, how would I play with the Swampfire? Well, it's kind of hard for me to do that, to think about that, because I didn't have one as a kid. And I'm looking at this with adult tinted eyes now versus kid eyes. Water to air. I didn't really have too much of that in my play patterns as a kid. I was more of the Navy and the Air Force were there to support the Army. But I like the helicopters. The helicopter portion is Army, that's Air Cav. And this would have been a great little helicopter for my Monkey Wrench or Torch to fly through, or even, Cobra Soldier. It would have had a place there just as the helicopter. Not so much the water. This thing could go everywhere, attacking the G.I. Joe headquarters and flying away, and then going after the transportable tactical battle platform. It has a variety of uses. While it's simple in armament, I think it makes up for its versatility in environment. And if you ignore the fact that like a lot of G.I. Joe toys from 85 on up, have open cockpits. It's not horrible having the open cockpit, even though that's inherently unsafe in a rotor-based helicopter. With that, how many do I like to have in my collection? How many would I display? How would I use it? For me, the Swampfire is having one or two is where I feel comfortable having it. I'm not a guy that, I'm somebody that's been cutting back recently. I once had 11 hisses and I'm down to 5, and I think that's enough. But with this, it's a one or two. I have one that's complete and nice, and I know I probably have another one somewhere else if I didn't cut it up. But I'm not going to go hunting for it, if you know what I mean. The versatility makes it good. The lack of armament is not the strongest suit. So now it's time to review it. And on a scale of 0 to 5, razor-tipped rotors, what does the Swampfire get in my world? It gets a 3 out of 5 razor-tipped rotors. And I will go on this. While it is a fine toy, it is a simple toy. It does have a couple neat little gimmicks. It is not something I want to build a fleet of. I think 1 or 2 is fine, especially with the small size of the Dreadnok cast, where I think it fits thematically well. But what really hurts it from me is its lack of armaments, and because I just need to, especially with the Dreadnoks, I just want to blow stuff up and cause havoc and chaos. And I feel the 125mm cannon, which looks like a laser, which is the only design aesthetic that I'm not a huge fan of, isn't enough for that role. That wraps up this Missal for the Masses. This has been the Chaplain's Assistance Motor Pod, and I have been your host, Gary. Thank you for listening. For more Chaplain's Assistance Motor Pod, you can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Chaplain Joe Pod, and even on rare occasion, YouTube as well. You can also reach out via email, chaplainjoepod@gmail.com. You can find the Chaplain's Assistance Motor Pod wherever you find your favorite podcasts. And also, as a little note, because this is brought to you by Spotify for podcasters, formerly Anchor.fm, I've been fooling around with the little feedback section in Spotify, which allows me to ask questions or polls. And I'm still playing a little bit around with that. So if you're listening on Spotify, feel free to interact with this and, answer the question or answer the poll. I haven't decided what I'm going to do yet, but it'll be something after I finish editing this Missal. Also, on whatever podcast you're listening on, feel free to like or review or rate it. It only helps the podcast get better. And with all of that out of the way, one final Missal for the Masses: be decent to each other.